Have you ever felt trapped in a situation where everything seemed carefully calculated to destabilize you? Emotional abuse rarely comes suddenly. Over time, the silent storm of emotional abuse consumes your peace, joy, and even your identity, starting with small, almost imperceptible gestures. Why then does emotional abuse seem to worsen over time, especially when the abuser is a narcissist? Narcissists don't just manipulate, they evolve. Their tactics become more refined as they observe and exploit the victim's vulnerabilities. They create a cycle where small emotional attacks, disguised as advice or constructive criticism, leave the victim doubting their own perceptions. At first, this may seem harmless, but over time, it becomes an unbearable burden. It's like walking through an apparently safe forest until you realize, too late, that you're sinking into quicksand. Each attempt to free oneself only seems to make the situation worse. At first, the narcissist charms, gains trust, and even promotes moments of harmony, but soon, the subtle criticisms and emotional manipulation take control. The victim, trying to restore the initial peace, ends up trying even harder, while the abuser uses that effort to consolidate their power. This dynamic not only emotionally drains, but also weakens the victim's ability to react. However, there is a greater truth. Jesus declared in John 10:10, "I have come that they may have life and have it to the full." God desires that you live in peace, not imprisoned by manipulations that steal your joy. Recognizing the problem is the first step to breaking the cycle. Seeking strength in faith can be the key to regaining dignity and inner peace. This invites one to understand the abuse and free themselves from it, trusting that God can turn even the hardest situations into triumphs. Before we begin, just a quick thank you to all of you. I couldn't have done this without you. However, the majority of you who are listening are not subscribers, so we kindly ask you to click the subscribe button and like this video. It's free and really helps our small team. Thank you very much. Narcissists do not just manipulate, they refine their tactics over time. They carefully adjust each gesture, word, or action to exploit their victims' vulnerabilities, as if they were part of a well-calculated plan. At first, these actions may seem harmless. A comment here, a subtle criticism there. But little by little, these small manipulations transform into an intricate web that emotionally ensnares those within their reach. This ability to precisely adjust tactics is what makes emotional abuse so insidious. Narcissists observe the victim's reactions, test their limits, and discover exactly where to attack in order to gain maximum control. This creates an environment where the victim feels constantly disoriented and insecure, but at the same time seeks the approval of the abuser, entering a vicious cycle. However, even in the face of such manipulation, there is hope. In Proverbs 26:24-26 we read, "He who hates disguises it with his lips, but in his heart he harbors deceit. His words may be pleasant, but do not trust him." This warning serves as a reminder that God bestows upon us the discernment to identify hidden intentions and the strength to resist deception. Divine wisdom is a light that exposes the lies that try to ensnare us. When we confront these tactics with the wisdom that comes from God, we begin to see patterns that were previously invisible. It's like seeing a spider's web when the light reflects on it. What once seemed imperceptible becomes clear. But this manipulation does not act in isolation. It becomes even more powerful when combined with emotional dependency. It is at this point that the narcissist's control intensifies and the victim needs even more strength to break the cycle. The key is to seek divine wisdom, for God calls us to live in freedom and dignity. The longer a person remains in an abusive relationship, the harder it becomes to break the cycle. The emotional, financial, or psychological dependency that develops is often fueled by the narcissists themselves, who know how to create this dynamic to reinforce their control. The abuser's presence, even if harmful, creates a fragile foundation for the relationship, making the victim feel incapable of functioning without it. The narcissist establishes this dependence gradually, undermining the victim's self-confidence while convincing them that he is their only source of stability or love. Comments like, "You would never make it without me," or "I do this because I care about you," create a sense of emotional debt that binds the victim to the relationship. At first, these statements may seem to carry a tone of care, but over time, they transform into suffocating chains. This dependence can also be financial. Narcissists often control resources, limit choices, and create scenarios where the victim feels they cannot survive on their own. Psychologically, they manipulate emotions, reinforcing the idea that any attempt at independence will be a failure. The victim begins to believe that there is no alternative but to remain in the cycle, perpetuating the abuser's control. However, the most dangerous emotional dependency is the one that disconnects the victim from their own identity and dignity. The narcissist shapes a reality where the victim sees themselves as inadequate or incompetent, believing they do not deserve more than what they are receiving. This creates a sense of entrapment that seems insurmountable. But God offers us a refuge. In Psalm 46:1 we read, "God is our refuge and strength, a very present help in trouble." Even when everything seems lost, God is the strength that can break the chains of dependency. He reminds us that our identity is not defined by an abusive relationship, but by His unconditional love and promise of liberation. Recognizing this truth is the first step to seeking help and finding freedom. However, while the victim struggles with their dependence, the narcissist strengthens their rigidity and resistance to change, making the process even more challenging. This resistance will be the next crucial element for understanding the impact of prolonged abuse. Write in the comments, "Emotional dependence does not define who you are. Freedom is in God." Emotional dependency does not define who you are. Freedom is in God. Share this message to help others find hope and strength. Narcissists rarely acknowledge their flaws or take responsibility for their actions. Their resistance to self-criticism is one of their most striking traits, and it grows over time. As they age, this emotional and behavioral rigidity intensifies, consolidating patterns of abuse that become almost automatic. The difficulty of a narcissist in accepting changes goes beyond personal pride. It reflects a spiritual barrier. In Proverbs 16:18 we read, "Pride goes before destruction." This passage reminds us that narcissism is, in its essence, a manifestation of pride that refuses to acknowledge limits or the need for growth. For the narcissist, admitting failures would be equivalent to relinquishing the control they strive so hard to maintain. Over time, this resistance directly affects the relationship. The narcissist becomes more inflexible and less willing to consider the needs or feelings of the victim. The repetition of abusive behaviors creates a destructive cycle where the abuser refuses to change and the victim, worn out, feels increasingly less capable of reacting. For the victim, this dynamic is exhausting. The emotional toll of facing a person who never admits mistakes or tries to improve is devastating. Every attempt at dialogue or confrontation meets with disdain, anger, or manipulation, leaving her in a state of constant tension. The victim begins to question whether it is worth resisting, and this doubt further fuels the narcissist's control. However, there is hope and strength available for those facing this situation. God offers us a different perspective, a source of courage and discernment. Proverbs 16:18 warns us about the dangers of pride, but it also points to the path of humility and grace. Although the narcissist's resistance may seem insurmountable, the Word of God encourages us to trust in His ability to transform even the most resistant hearts. While the abuser refuses to change, the victim needs to find ways to protect their peace and dignity. Recognizing that your strength lies in God and not in the attempts to fix the narcissist is a crucial step. But the emotional weariness that this resistance causes makes the next challenge even greater: the struggle to maintain the ability to react and seek help amidst exhaustion. Emotional abuse not only causes momentary pain, it leaves deep scars that accumulate over time. Each harsh word, each subtle manipulation, and each moment of control drains the victim's emotional energy until exhaustion sets in. The victim's ability to resist or set boundaries weakens over time, a gradual and continuous process. And the more the victim wears down, the more the narcissist intensifies their control. This exhaustion is not just physical, it affects the heart and the mind. The victim begins to question their own strength, their decisions, and in many cases, their dignity. The feeling of being trapped in an endless cycle becomes overwhelming. Small, everyday acts like responding to criticism or trying to express your own needs start to seem like insurmountable challenges. Jesus recognizes this emotional and spiritual burden when he invites us. "Come to me, all you who are weary and burdened, and I will give you rest." Matthew 11:28. For those who feel completely drained of strength, this promise not only offers consolation, but also serves as a source of spiritual renewal. It is a reminder that we do not have to face this battle alone. For the narcissist, the victim's emotional exhaustion is an opportunity. As the victim loses energy to react, control becomes even easier. Every moment of weakness they exploit serves to reaffirm their dominance, intensifying the manipulations and fostering an even greater dependency. The cumulative impact of this abuse goes beyond the emotional. It affects the victim's mental health, potentially leading to anxiety, depression, and a profound sense of isolation. It's like carrying a backpack that gets heavier each day until the weight becomes unbearable. But even in the midst of this darkness, there is a way out. The promise of Jesus is a light for those who are emotionally exhausted. He offers rest for the soul, renewal for the heart, and strength to resist. Finding this peace requires a step of faith and the courage to seek help, both spiritual and practical. While the victim tries to find the strength to move on, the narcissist, in turn, intensifies their abuses, especially when confronted with the fear of losing relevance or control. As they age, many narcissists face an increasing fear of losing control and relevance. This fear is not just a matter of vanity, it is a direct threat to the sense of identity they have built over their lives. For them, control means power, and the loss of that power equates to an existential crisis. In response, they intensify their abusive behaviors, using emotional manipulation and more severe tactics to reaffirm their authority at any cost. This behavior often manifests in subtle ways, such as constant criticism, attempts to undermine the victim's confidence, or even demanding excessive attention. But it can also be more direct, involving outbursts of anger or the imposition of strict rules that limit the victim's autonomy. This desire for affirmation not only emotionally drains those around, but also creates an environment where tension is constant and harmony seems impossible. For the narcissist, the fear of losing relevance is not something they express openly. Rather, they mask it with accusations, demands, and manipulations. Each interaction is an opportunity to reaffirm their control, while the victim becomes an accessible target to unload these anxieties. In Philippians 4:6-7, we are encouraged, "Do not be anxious about anything, and the peace of God, which surpasses all understanding, will guard your hearts and your minds." This passage is a reminder that true peace does not come from control over others, but from trust in God. For the narcissist, the pursuit of control is an attempt to fill a void that only God can heal. And for the victim, that same peace is the key to resisting the emotional impact of the abuse. The effect of this desire for absolute control is devastating, especially because it often results in the social isolation of the victim. The narcissist, fearing loss of relevance, tries to distance the victim from their support network, creating an even greater dependency. This not only reinforces the cycle of abuse, but also deprives the victim of emotional and spiritual resources that could help them break free from the destructive dynamic. This isolation is one of the cruelest aspects of abuse, but faith can shine brightest there. Seeking support from God and the community can make a difference between being trapped in this cycle and finding the strength to seek freedom. Isolation, however, is just another layer of this complex cycle, which we will continue to explore. Narcissists know that social isolation is one of the most effective tools to maintain control over their victims. By restricting or weakening the victim's social circles, they create a suffocating emotional dependency where the only meaningful connection seems to be with the abuser themselves. This strategy not only limits the victim's options for seeking support, but also reinforces the false narrative that the narcissist is indispensable. This isolation begins subtly. Disdainful comments about the victim's friends or family, criticism of external influences, or even the creation of unnecessary conflicts slowly drive away those who could offer support. Over time, the victim realizes that their social interactions have diminished, often without fully understanding how this happened. The result is a profound sense of loneliness, which intensifies emotional imprisonment and the difficulty of seeing alternatives to the abusive relationship. The Bible calls us to fellowship in Hebrews 10:25, where we read, "Let us not give up meeting together, as some are in the habit of doing, but let us encourage one another." This call to communion is essential, for God knows that the support of the community is a source of strength and renewal. Isolation is a tool of the abuser, but communion is a powerful weapon to break cycles of control and manipulation. For the victim, breaking the isolation is an enormous challenge, especially because the narcissist may react with even more manipulation. Frequently, they use their own physical or emotional fragility as a justification to keep the victim close, creating feelings of guilt that make distancing difficult. Statements like, "I only have you," or "No one understands me like you do," reinforce dependence and worsen isolation. Despite these difficulties, there is hope. Reconnecting with God and a supportive community can help the victim realize that they are not alone and that there are paths to freedom. Although isolation may appear like an unbreakable prison, one can overcome the barriers with faith and courage. However, the narcissist often intensifies their tactics, exploiting physical or emotional weaknesses, which makes the challenge even more complex but not insurmountable. In old age, many narcissists find a new tool for manipulation: physical or emotional fragility. Allegations of illness, vulnerability, or suffering become justifications for abusive behaviors, creating a cycle of guilt and control that is even harder to break. Phrases like, "I am old, I need you," or "You don't understand what I'm going through," are used to divert attention from their actions and place the emotional burden of the relationship on the victim. This manipulation is especially effective because it appeals to the victim's empathy and sense of responsibility. Often she feels compelled to take care of the abuser, ignoring her own boundaries to meet his demands. Rather than seeking mutual support, the narcissist creates a one-way dynamic where their needs always take precedence. This justification of fragility not only reinforces the narcissist's control, but also prevents the victim from establishing healthy boundaries. Any attempt to distance oneself or confront the abusive behavior is met with accusations of insensitivity or abandonment, deepening feelings of guilt. Romans 12:18 offers us a path of balance. If it is possible, as far as it depends on you, live at peace with everyone. This passage reminds us that living in peace does not mean tolerating abuse. On the contrary, it involves setting clear boundaries to protect our dignity and emotional health. Even in challenging situations, it is possible to show compassion without allowing control to perpetuate. As the narcissist utilizes the victim's vulnerability as a weapon, they gradually accumulate traumas that become nearly intolerable. The emotional wear and tear caused by constant manipulation and the burden of unshared responsibility deeply affects their mental health. This burden is not just heavy, it is a weight that steals energy, joy, and often the ability to make clear decisions. Recognizing this dynamic is the first step to breaking the cycle. The victim needs to understand that their compassion should not be exploited, and that seeking help is not an act of selfishness, but of survival. The use of vulnerability by the narcissist is a powerful tactic, but with faith and courage, it is possible to set boundaries and regain the peace that God desires for all His children. Emotional abuse rarely happens in a single episode. It is a repetitive and cumulative process where each incident leaves a deep mark on the victim. Each destructive criticism, manipulation, or outburst of anger adds layers of trauma that accumulate over time. The impact is not only emotional, but also psychological and spiritual, affecting the way the victim sees themselves, others, and even God. This accumulated trauma often results in anxiety, depression, and an almost total loss of self-confidence. The victim begins to question their own worth and abilities, believing in the destructive narratives that the abuser insists on reinforcing. Emotional exhaustion and the feeling of being trapped make it increasingly difficult to seek help or react. It's like carrying an invisible backpack that gets heavier each day until the weight becomes unbearable. The burdened can find comfort in Isaiah 41:10, "Do not fear, for I am with you. Do not be dismayed, for I am your God. I will strengthen you and help you." This promise is a reminder that even in the darkest moments, God is present, offering strength and courage to face internal and external struggles. The cumulative effect of trauma also affects the victim's ability to set boundaries or confront the abuser. More manipulation or emotional attacks can counter each attempt at resistance, making the victim believe it is safer to remain silent. This dynamic creates a destructive cycle where the abuser continues to act without real consequences. The absence of consequences for the narcissist perpetuates the cycle of abuse, giving them a sense of impunity. Unconfronted actions encourage them to intensify their abusive behaviors, thereby increasing the emotional burden on the victim. Recognizing this pattern is essential to breaking the cycle. Although the accumulated pain is real and heavy, God's promise to stand by the oppressed offers a way out. He strengthens the weary hearts, renews hope, and opens paths to healing. Breaking the cycle is not easy, but it is possible when the victim finds strength in God and in resources that help restore their identity and dignity. Divine justice and the courage to act are the keys to transforming this reality. One of the most devastating factors that make the emotional abuse of a narcissist so persistent and insidious is the absence of real consequences. When the narcissist is not confronted or punished for their abusive behavior, they feel encouraged to manipulate and control more. This sense of impunity not only perpetuates the cycle of abuse, but also increases its emotional and psychological impact on the victim, who feels even more trapped and helpless. The cycle of impunity begins almost imperceptibly. Small abusive actions like subtle criticisms, emotional manipulations, or gaslighting often go unnoticed or ignored. The victim, often seeking to avoid conflicts or believing that the narcissist's behavior is temporary, does not react or set boundaries. This sends a message to the narcissist: I can continue. Each unchallenged incident reinforces this dynamic, creating a spiral in which the abuser feels their actions are immune to consequences. Over time, the narcissist intensifies their tactics, knowing that the victim, already emotionally drained, will have difficulty reacting. This sense of impunity is fueled by the lack of clear boundaries, the absence of confrontation, and often by the victim's hope that the abuser will change on their own. The impact on the victim. For the victim, the absence of consequences for the narcissist is extremely demoralizing. She begins to believe that her voice doesn't matter, or that any attempt to set boundaries will be ignored or ridiculed. This fosters a climate of hopelessness and surrender, where people embrace abuse as an inescapable aspect of existence. The result is a constant state of emotional alertness, chronic anxiety, and a profound loss of self-confidence. The victim may begin to internalize the narcissist's criticisms, believing that they deserve the treatment they are receiving or that they are incapable of leaving the relationship. This emotional impact is devastating, eroding the victim's identity and weakening their ability to seek help or react. Divine justice, a beacon in the darkness. Amidst this feeling of impunity, the promise of divine justice offers a source of hope and strength. In Ecclesiastes 3:17, we are reminded that God will judge all actions. This truth is a powerful reminder that even when earthly justice seems to fail, God sees all things and will bring justice in due time. For the victim, this perspective is essential. Recognizing that divine justice is certain and that God is a refuge in times of distress can offer the necessary courage to start setting boundaries and seeking help. It is also a reminder that no one is truly beyond God's reach, including the abuser. Establishing real consequences. While divine justice is certain, it is equally important that the victim, with the help of God and a support network, begins to establish practical consequences for the narcissist's behavior. This may include clear communication, seeking external help, emotional separation, and professional support. The role of community and faith. The faith community also plays a vital role in interrupting the cycle of impunity. Hebrews 10:25 calls us to maintain fellowship and encourage one another. This fellowship can be a source of strength for the victim, offering practical and spiritual support. The church, friends, and spiritual leaders can help the victim understand that setting boundaries and seeking safety is not an act of selfishness, but a reflection of God's love for His creation. God calls us to live in freedom, dignity, and peace, and supporting those trapped in cycles of abuse is a way to reflect that love. Breaking the cycle. Breaking the cycle of emotional abuse requires a conscious and often courageous effort. The victim needs to understand that their safety and dignity are priorities, and that seeking help is not a sign of weakness, but of strength. Divine justice is a comfort, but practical action, grounded in faith and community support, is essential to changing the dynamics of the relationship. By imposing limits and creating real consequences for the narcissist's behavior, the victim takes the first step toward emotional and spiritual freedom. And even if the abuser resists or does not change, God remains a source of strength, peace, and renewal. Conclusion. The absence of consequences is one of the most destructive forces in an abusive relationship, but it is not insurmountable. Ecclesiastes 3:17 reminds us that God sees everything and will judge all actions. This promise is a reminder that the narcissist's impunity is not permanent and that the victim is not alone. With faith, community support, and practical actions, it is possible to break the cycle of impunity and find the peace that God desires for all His children. Divine justice may sometimes seem distant, but it is certain, and it is this certainty that offers hope for the future. The journey to freedom is not easy, but it is possible. With the help of God and a support network, it is possible to rebuild self-esteem, renew hope, and find peace. No matter how oppressive the cycle of abuse may seem, God's grace is sufficient to bring liberation and healing. God desires that we live in fullness, free from the shackles of fear and manipulation. In His presence, we find the strength to move forward and the certainty that, with Him, restoration is always possible. This is the promise that transforms lives and restores dignity to all who trust in Him.